Okay, so Summer Farage just got married to Jake Benedict, and somehow, instead of everyone celebrating, the internet immediately turned into a detective agency because people were convinced the wedding was fake. Not just, this looks like a little staged. People were saying Jake doesn't actually love Summer, and that two of them are literally siblings because they share a last name. And somehow, one of the biggest theories was the entire wedding was filmed on a green screen. And after seeing all those reactions, Summer finally decided to address the whole thing. But before we get into what she said, let's go back to the actual wedding. Summer and Jake had already publicly shared their relationship and wedding plans before the ceremony. And now, wedding footage started circulating showing Summer in a wedding dress and Jake dressed for the ceremony. Jake also publicly presented the event as their wedding, with the post literally saying, "We got married." So you would think that would be pretty straightforward. They got married, end of the story. Apparently not, because the internet saw the footage and immediately started questioning basically everything. And the first accusations was probably the most personal one. Jake doesn't love her. And this came from the way Jake apparently behaved during the ceremony. Some viewers expected this huge emotional reaction from him. You know, the dramatic crying, staring at the bride like she's the only person in the room, all of that. But Jake wasn't apparently giving people the reaction they expected. And instead of simply saying maybe that's just his personality, people started using his reaction as evidence that he wasn't actually in love with Summer. And honestly, this is where I think the internet can get a little ridiculous. Because how exactly are we supposed to determine whether someone loves their partner based on a few seconds of wedding footage? We don't know what someone is hiding just because they're not crying. And Summer actually addressed this herself. She explained that the relationship is real, but she doesn't want Jake to suddenly put an entire performance just because cameras are around. And according to Summer, that's actually one of the things she loves about him. He's his own person. So basically, her argument is that Jake wasn't supposed to suddenly become a completely different person just because millions of people might be watching. And honestly, I can understand that. But then we got the second theory, and this was interesting. People were saying that Sama and Jake were literally siblings. Why? Because they have the same last name? That's it? The internet saw Farage and apparently went straight to, wait, are they related? And Sama actually addressed this too. She basically said, yes, they have the same last name. Moving on, which is probably the funniest way she could have responded to the accusations. Because imagine getting married and then having to explain to the internet that you are not secretly marrying your sibling because you happen to share a surname. But then come the biggest accusations of all. People start saying the entire wedding was fake. And not just fake in the sense of being staged for content. People were apparently claiming that the whole thing was filmed using a green screen. Now, this is where the story really gets interesting, because Summer didn't just say no, it's real. She gave an explanation for why she says it was a real wedding. She said their friends and family were there. She said they had an entire menu. They had an actual ceremony, and she basically asked, why would we fake an entire wedding? And this is honestly the question I kept coming back to. Because if someone is going to claim that a wedding is fake, there needs to be something more substantial than it looked weird to me. At that moment, the strongest evidence we have is that Summer and Jake themselves publicly presented the event as their wedding, and Summer has now directly addressed the claims. That doesn't mean we can independently verify every detail of the ceremony of their legal marriage status. But it does mean that this was definitely fake theory is not something we should suddenly treat as fact. It's an internet story, and Sama is directly rejecting it. But then she added another detail that caught my attention. She brought up the brother that appeared with her during the World Cup. Remember that? Summer basically reminded viewers that the same person people had previously seen with her was also at the wedding. And again, she seems to be trying to clear up the confusion around who is actually related to whom. So, when you put all those theories together, You basically have three completely different accusations. One group thought Jake didn't love Summer because he wasn't emotional enough. Another group somehow concluded that Summer and Jake were siblings because they share a surname. And another group thought the entire wedding was fabricated and possibly even filmed using screen technology. And Summer's response was essentially, the relationship is real, the wedding was real, and Jake doesn't need to perform for the cameras. Now, here's where I think the situation gets more interesting than the actual wedding, because this is the perfect example of how social media works. People see a few seconds of someone's life, maybe an interpretation, and then the interpretation spreads until suddenly it becomes a story. Someone says Jake looks uncomfortable. Someone else says maybe he doesn't love her. And someone takes that even further. Maybe the relationship is fake. That somehow else notice that they have the same last name. Wait, are the sibling? And suddenly we are no longer talking about a wedding. We're talking about an entire conspiracy. And that's probably why Summer felt to need to address it. Because when enough people repeat the same theory, it can start sounding like an established fact, even when there isn't actual evidence behind it. And that's something we should be careful about, especially with the relationship drama, because we genuinely don't know what happens when two people, when the cameras aren't there. We don't know actually what Jake was feeling at the altar. We don't know what every guest experienced at the wedding. And unless the release documentations proving the legal marriage, we shouldn't pretend we independently verified either. What we do know is that couple publicly presented themselves as married. There was a public wedding footage, and Sama now directly responded to the accusations surrounding it. So, was the wedding fake? Based on the evidence currently available, we don't have a solid base to say it was. Was Jake's reaction proof that he doesn't love Summer? Also now, a facial expression isn't exactly a relationship lie detector. And are Summer and Jake secretly siblings? Well, Summer herself has addressed this one. The bigger question is why this wedding created so much suspicion in the first place. Maybe the footage genuinely looked unusual to some viewers. Maybe people were simply surprised by how the ceremony played out. Or maybe the internet did what the internet does best and turned a few confusing details into a full blown conspiracy. Either way, Summer has now given her side, and honestly, after all of this, I'm more curious, what do you guys think? Did the wedding footage genuinely look suspicious to you, or do you think the internet took that one way too far? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll meet you in the next video. Until then, bye!